Alberico was many things, a friend and patron to troubadours, an Occitan poet, a mercenary, and a Podesta. But being politically allied to his notoriously cruel brother Ecelino didn't help Alberico when he was eventually captured by papal troops. What was Alberico so guilty of that had caused him to be hated in the Italian city of Treviso? The Middle Ages were violent, pitiless, and revenge-driven times. So today we continue our Day in the Life series and travel back in time to see what life was like for Alberico Ezzelino on the worst day of his life, the day that he faced his execution. Now, a quick heads up, this video is a fictionalized first-person account of a man being tortured and murdered, so it's pretty gnarly. Just a warning in case you're eating your breakfast or just, don't want to hear about a man being slaughtered. Welcome to Medieval Madness. The beginning. I was born in the castle of San Zenone in the province of Treviso, where I grew up with my 7 brothers and sisters. We lived in the Italian region of Veneto, about 30 miles away from the most beautiful Republic of Venice. My father was Ecelino II de Romano, who held the highest civil office in central and northern Italy, and was Lord of Onora, Romano, Bassano, and Godigo. My mother was Adelaide de Mangona, daughter of Count Alberto IV. Long before we were born in 1182, our father quarrelled with some monks over land in Sesto al Regana, and he was excommunicated by the Pope. Despite this, in 1191 he was given one of the highest civil offices in the government when he was made Podesta of Treviso. Eventually, in 1198, Pope Innocent III asked the Patriarch of Aquileia to step in and resolve the matter of the monastery lands and lift the exclusion. My eldest brother Ecelino was sent to Verona when he was 4 years old to be kept there as a hostage. It seemed that my father was always at war with someone or some province or other, whether it be Treviso or Gonzia. Anyway, in 1199 the Paduan soldiers came and we had to flee our castle in Onora, which was destroyed, and move to Romano. But I was just a baby at this time and I don't remember any of these things. Weary with all the fighting, in 1221 my father retired to a monastery. He left all of his castles and villages in Vicenza to me and those in Treviso to my brother Ecelino. We fought together side by side, my brother and I, against the Paduans, the Venetians, and with the Holy Roman Empire against the papacy. And we weren't ashamed to challenge alliances whenever we felt the need. We faced many plotters and enemies together, and Ecelino used whatever means were at his disposal to defeat them, whether that was torture or cruelty. We became very powerful. Too powerful for some, and even the Pope excommunicated us. Sadly, Ecelino was wounded by the supporters of Pope Alexander IV with an arrow at the Battle of Cassano in 1259. He was captured and died in the castle of Soncino, and then they came for me. They came to Treviso from Venice, Padua, Trent, and Vicenza, and even though I was the Podesta there, we were chased from the city. On the 25th of August 1260, we fled to the castle of my birth, to San Zenone, in the hope that we would be safe there. But soon we were completely surrounded. What else could I do but surrender? My shame was great, but for the sake of my family, my wife, sons, and daughters, I threw myself on the mercy of my captives. The boys. I was put in chains and dragged out into the piazza, with hundreds of people screaming and baying for my blood. I had never seen or heard such hatred. I wanted to be brave and face them, but my knees buckled and I couldn't even stand up straight when the soldiers dragged my innocent boys out into the square. The 3 youngest of them were crying hysterically, but I could see that the eldest was trying to be brave, to be proud, and raise his head to look up into the faces of our accusers. On seeing them, my wife, my beautiful brave Margherita, fell on her knees. She pleaded and begged, howling like an injured animal for the lives of our sons. For Alberico, Romano, Ugolino, and Giovanni, who was only a baby. But the loathing for my brother Ecelino and the suffering that he had caused was too great. The people could see and feel nothing but their blind hatred. Then the soldiers began to hack at them with their swords, slicing off arms and legs, whilst my poor children were still alive. So much red blood everywhere, the leering faces of the monstrous soldiers and the cheering of the crowd. Then the brutes picked up the arms of 2 of our now dead sons and hit Margherita and I in the face with them, laughing as though it was the funniest thing in the world to assault a father and a mother with the severed limbs of their dead boys. the girls. Then, not satisfied with the devastation already caused to Marguerite and I, they dragged out my poor innocent daughters and paraded them naked through the square as though they were low-born prostitutes. They grabbed Margarita and tore the clothes from her too until she stood there naked and ashamed. All the while the crowd laughed and joked. Some men acted like animals. They pressed forward and tried to grab my wife's breasts and grope my daughters' bodies. When the soldiers came forward and began to drive stakes into the ground, a wave of excitement went through the already frenzied crowd. "Mercy!" I screamed as I saw the wild fear in the eyes of my wife. "Mercy!" My pure, beautiful girls, Griselda, Amabilia, and Tomalis, were young and innocent and had caused no harm to anyone. But my pleas fell on deaf ears and the carnage continued. Once the stakes were in place, my wife and daughters were all tied to each one of them, with their hands forced behind their backs. Then more men carried out heavy bunches of twigs and branches, all bound together with twine, and began to pile them up at their feet. Suddenly a soldier stepped forward. Grinning, he held a large blade, and before I knew what was happening, he cut off their noses. It's unmeasurable cruelness, too heartbreaking to see their beautiful faces mutilated like that. They were guilty of nothing. Finally, to the enthusiastic roaring of the crowd, 4 soldiers entered the piazza carrying flaming torches, each one standing before the woman and girls that I loved, and ignoring their pleas for pity and relief, they threw the burning torches onto the bundles of sticks. Because the wood was so dry, it caught alight quickly. The crackling began, followed by horrified gasps, and then the never-ending screaming. I hung my head and looked at the floor, wanting to block out the image before me. But the soldier to my left gripped my hair and yanked up my head so that I was forced to look on horrified as the flames licked at their legs and that high-pitched, piteous moaning and wailing continued. At last, the crowd fell silent and watched, entranced as the flames burned away my family. Griselda was the first to be consumed, being the smallest, but soon all of my ladies were enveloped in their own personal fireball. The sickly stench made me gag, and I was not alone, for I saw many people in the crowd that were sickened by the sight and the stink, and finally it was done, and their suffering was over. The end. But still not satisfied with all the death and horror that they had witnessed, the monstrous crowd turned their gaze onto me. "Let him die, let him die," they began to chant. And then I became paralyzed with fear when I saw him. My own executioner, the man whom I had given instructions to many, many times. Instructions to use whatever means were necessary when interrogating the prisoners. And here he was now, standing before me, that blank look of indifference that he always carried there on his ugly face. I looked down and saw to my horror that he carried metal tongs in his hand. I was trembling so much, and I had no strength to stand, so the soldiers brought out another stake and tied me to it, along with a brazier which they filled with burning coals. The executioner placed his iron pliers into the fire and waited until they were glowing hot. There was a loud hiss, and I shrieked as the skin on my arm dissolved before my eyes. The greasy stink of my own melted flesh spiraled up, invading my nostrils. The injury was repeated over and over again on my feet, my chest, and my stomach, until it was as though there wasn't a piece of untouched skin left anywhere on my body. The pain was so terrible, and it felt as though it went on for hours. I could no longer hear the roaring of the crowd, just the pounding of my own heartbeat rushing through my ears. Thankfully, I drifted in and out of consciousness, and every time I kept on thinking, why can't I just die? Finally, and with the belief that I had still not suffered enough, rope was tied around my ankles, and I was fastened to the tail of the most spirited horse that they could find, only to be dragged through the streets of the city that I once commanded. But they were too late. By this point, I was already mercifully dead. The chronicler Salambin de Adam noted that before his gruesome death and the death of his family, Alberico was responsible for the execution of 25 civic leaders of Treviso. He hanged all the men over the course of one day and forced the daughters, wives, mothers, and sisters of those men to stand naked between the, quote, involuntary jerking legs and feet as they suffocated and died. The women were then exiled from the city and forced to leave right away, still naked. This, along with his brother Ecelino's reputation as a notoriously cruel tyrant, may help in some part to explain the hatred of Alberico by the citizens of Treviso. Please note that this video is a work of fiction based on the true events that transpired on the 26th of August 1260 when Alberico de Romano found himself a prisoner of unforgiving papal troops. His death and the viciousness with which his family was slaughtered were recorded by Salambine, who assured his readers that he saw this with his own eyes. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and I'll see you next week for another video. Cheers.